Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm Natasha, and my goal is to help equip leaders with tools to make their leadership journey easier and more expansive. We're continuing with talking about feedback, and today we're going to focus on how you set yourself up to give feedback, and then also some common traps we fall into when we're giving feedback. So part of setting the environment for feedback is setting ourselves up for success. What do we need to do going into the session to make sure that we show up as the leader we want to be and the leader that we are and the leader that other person deserves? So, a couple of things here. Before you go into the session, take a few notes to make sure you stay on track, just in case things get intense or uncomfortable. Sometimes if someone gets very defensive or they have just an emotional reaction to the feedback, we want to make sure that the feedback then doesn't go out the window. We're not being robots, right? But we also want to make sure that we're having this conversation for a reason. And we can sit better with some of that discomfort, knowing that we have that North Star, that compass, if you will, that gets us back to what it is that we need to deliver. The second thing is you want to take a few minutes to clear your mind. So, Oscar Trimboli, in his book, How to Listen, talks about how taking a few minutes to listen to yourself, like what's coming up, what's on your mind that's preventing you from listening to the other person. When you can really think through those things, it helps you to compartmentalize them a bit when you go into this conversation. Doesn't mean you won't deal with those things later, but you can't resolve them in those few minutes. So, this is an acknowledgement of them, pausing those thoughts, and you could even jot them down, but that's something you're going to sort out later. So, we're clearing our mind in that moment. And then next, taking several deep breaths. I like to say that an oxygenated brain is a thinking brain. And so, breathing deeply, science has shown, can calm our nervous system so that we are more present, and then we really can show up how we want. I also want to talk about some of the thinking traps and biases that can prevent us from receiving and giving feedback. The thinking traps and biases that we fall into are based on our own experiences and environment. So these are just some of the most common ones that we see in feedback situations, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list. I think at last check, there are over 200 different biases. So just remember that they're out there, they're very common, and just really acknowledging and being aware as much as you can of yours can be really helpful in feedback conversations and just as a leader in general. So, perceptual biases are the most common thinking traps. And these ones really show up in feedback conversations. And at their core, they're biases that we have based on our perception, right? So, the affinity bias can show up here, where we tend to where we tend to like and gravitate towards people and experiences that are similar to ours. So, in feedback, we may not be giving the best, most actionable feedback because we believe that people get it, right? Like they get it, they're like us, so we don't need to go into that. Or we think they're never going to get it because they aren't like us. So that's where the affinity bias can really show up in feedback. Another really common bias here is confirmation bias, where we look for things that prove us right. So we have a tendency to harp on those things more intensely. And then with that, the negativity bias, where we see only the negative or the bad in a situation, can come into play as well. Right. So we just always kind of trend towards the negative, trend towards a thing that's not future leaning. Like I said in a previous episode, feedback needs to be future leaning, and the negativity bias can really prevent that. Another thinking trap we can really easily fall into is not listening, especially when the other person is defensive or not listening to what we're trying to tell them in the feedback. Even if the other person seems to be not connecting to the feedback, we need to remember to keep listening, right? The way that someone else shows up does not get to determine who we are and how we show up. So while we cannot really know every bias or thinking trap we might fall into, many of them are blind spots, and blind spots are blind spots for a reason. We can do our own reflection after a feedback conversation occurs and even get feedback from those we give feedback to. I'd say wait a little bit after you've given the feedback, but then you can certainly solicit that feedback from them. Thanks for listening.